Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to look at how Bollywood expresses contemporary issues, and then how, through that expression and just generally the popular culture itself, has impacted on wider society both positively and negatively. So, why Bollywood reflects social values? As we know, Bollywood is supposed to remain relevant in order to be consumed. And as we know, as all popular cultures, their aim is to make money. They want to have wide access and consumption. And so, by maintaining relevancy, they can ensure that that could happen. And so, they continue to represent current issues. Also, on top of that, they've also not only represented contemporary issues within India, but as we know, they've begun to represent contemporary issues outside of India as well. Whilst this may affect their consumption, as conservative groups within India are not necessarily happy about this, it's necessary for them to garner and maintain interest from wider audiences as well. And so they are continuing to project Western issues and diasporic issues within their films as well. Also, on top of that, the opening of the Indian economy to the free market, which has happened in the last 20 years, has seen an increase in the T&Cs, which surprisingly, or maybe not, India is known as being second in the world for having the most Fortune 500 company headquarters in the country. So there has been a significant increase in the TCs that are represented and exist within India to this day. And this has kind of led to a growing middle class within India. And because of that, they've had an increase in growing individualism and materialism, especially within or amongst the youth and middle class, which is also being reflected in Bollywood. So whilst they're representing what appears to be more westernized values, this is also kind of connected to the youth and growing middle class in India as well. So kind of that creasing in the Indian market has also led to India's reflection, Bollywood's reflection of contemporary values. So how Bollywood reflects these social and social contemporary values is through essentially four means, and the first is through the shifting internal mythologies. So as we know, Bollywood has moved away from valorizing the poor to reflecting wealthy lives and their issues, and this can be tied to the changes to the wealthy middle class and youth within India, but also the growing westernized and diasporic audiences. Also, they have shifted, as we saw in previous lessons looking at gender, from a traditional woman to a more modern empowered woman, which, as we know, is very much reflected within Queen, the film, and that kind of shift has occurred again because of that growing middle class, increasing in and changing gender values within society and women's roles in society, as well as that increasing Western audiences as well. And then, and this again can be directly related to the changes and shifts in India's economy, as well as the growing diasporic audiences. So we're seeing the portrayal of the modern young middle class. They're represented as independent. This is seen through the lack of family or the presence of family as much as what it used to be in previous Bollywood films. The suggestion, not necessarily showing, although a couple of films are showing this now, of premarital sex. So it's kind of just assumed that it's happening. It's not necessarily directly dealt with, but it's kind of there. It's definitely no longer seen as a taboo. We're seeing a lot more drinking. Pretty much all the films that you would have watched for this unit demonstrate some drinking, some form of drinking and partying, both by the women and the men, and then also live-in relationships. Again, most of the time it's suggested, although sometimes represented as well. So the couples that are living together before they're married. And then we also see this through the shifting external mythology, so how the personas around the stars and kind of how they're being projected. So a lot of the personas built around the stars now are really reflecting that more westernized, modernized view. So looking at their brands associations, their lifestyles, the relationships that they're in. And again, this is reflecting some of the internal mythologies as well, in terms of like live-in relationships, premarital sex, drinking, partying, consumerism, individualism. So the following of their lives and their wealth and their individualism individualism and their materialism is definitely kind of representing those shift in social values both for diasporic Indian audiences as well as the growing youth and middle classes within India. And definitely their brand association helps to emphasize that as well, and kind of the media following around, the advertisements that they're utilized in, the photographs seen with the brands that they're associated with is really kind of helping to propel that materialistic change in social value within India as well as for Indians outside of India as well. And then also through paraphernalia, Bollywood is reflecting contemporary social values. So this can be seen through music and the music videos that are being produced, which is something we're going to cover in a little bit more detail as well throughout this lesson. We're seeing more Western style influences, both through the style of music, like the electro-pop, the music remixes, bit of rapping, bit of reggae, kind of that introduction into Indian music, whilst also having a semi-traditional style, as well as the dance styles and clothings that we're seeing in a lot of the video clips that are accompanied with this music styles, is again reflecting these contemporary social values of wealth, materialism, individualism, as well as Western ideals and influences. And then magazines as well kind of help to perpetuate that, focusing on the stars and the stories around them, and encouraging more consumerist, individualistic attitudes. And then lastly, the clothing associated with the Bollywood films. As we know, they're kind of taking on a more Western style or Western influence. They're a little bit more sexualized, especially in regards to women. And then this is kind of reproduced and sold en masse to Indian audiences as well as diasporic audiences. So again, reflecting those shifting attitudes towards women and their sexuality, as well as how they should look and behave in society. And then lastly, product placement. So as we know, product placement has increased in Bollywood, and this little table reflects that. So, and this is only in a 3-year period, and even from 2005 to 2008, we're seeing it pretty much double in terms of how many products and how constant those products are being represented within Bollywood. And they're just, they tend to be expensive, aspirational brands that are continuously reflected through the Bollywood films, again representing that materialistic, individualistic attitudes that are becoming more prevalent within Indian society. So when we discuss the impacts Bollywood is having through the kind of this reflection or changing reflections of our contemporary issues within society, when we talk about it in terms of positive and negative, we need to be careful in terms of how we kind of discuss that, because the concept of positive and negative aspects of popular culture is subjective. It's based on our own kind of worldviews as well as others' worldviews, experiences and values. And so what is deemed to be positive for one group may be seen as negative for another group. So as we go through this, I have kind of broken it up into positive and negative, but we'll kind of discuss overall how this may be positive for some groups, but then negative for others, and then vice versa. So just take that kind of on note that whilst they're categorized in positive and negatives, not all of them are holistically positive or holistically negative, and not necessarily agreed upon by the majority of society. So as we know, Bollywood has been paralleled with Indian culture. So this has been initially established through its development on a local level through the use of Falki cinema, and then as it developed to that national level through representing nationalistic issues and pre and post independence. It's really kind of helped to solidify India as being, Bollywood as being really representative of that Indian nationality and Indian culture. And so because of that, Bollywood is seen to both reflect Indian society and Indian culture, but what it represents is also internalized by Indian society. As we've kind of already previously looked at, Indians really look to Bollywood as a representation of who they are and their identity and their national identity and their cultural identity. And so because of that, what they represent is also internalized in Indians' understandings of their nationality and their identity. And so, yeah, as we've seen through also that development from that local to a global level, you know, taking that that notion of Bollywood being this mass representation of Indian identity and Indian culture, the increasing of diasporic and foreign audiences, that attitude hasn't changed. So the diasporic audiences as well as foreign audiences look to Bollywood as that representation of Indian identity, and so because of that, they're also influenced by Bollywood and its representations of contemporary social values. And so this kind of all comes back to the fact that Bollywood is synonymous with India. And so therefore it becomes the medium for global audiences to see and experience the Indian nation, society, culture and its people. So just for Indians within India and diasporic or Indians as outside of India, the growing global audience also looked to Bollywood as that representation of Indian identity, Indian culture and its people. So, you know, the way Bollywood represents different issues and values is really kind of used as a way to understand those values and issues from an Indian perspective. So some of the positive impacts, and again to note and remember that, you know, positive is a bit of a loaded term, and that it may be positive for some and not for others. So as we know, Bollywood was previously used as a means to project Indian nationhood, culture and identity. So as we know, before independence, before 1947, and when the British still maintained control over India, Bollywood was used as a means to create a dialogue and a dichotomy around British colonialism and control over India. And so it was used as a means to challenge that control whilst also projecting and establishing an Indian culture and social identity. And then post-independence, Bollywood was used as that kind of discussion around, well, what should we be? What are we now that Britain is gone? What kind of society should we be? And so really was used to project and establish that national identity, as well as kind of understandings on Indian society and how it should operate. And that's really why Bollywood valorized the poor, because they were a mass group. So partly because, you know, it helps with the consumption of Bollywood because they're such a big group, so they definitely want to target the mass group. But also on top of that, it was really about, you know, questioning who they are and what kind of society they should be. And the focus was on building up the nation, and so the poor would really use as an image to kind of aid and help to do that. And then another issue that's kind of represented within Bollywood, both interestingly through the films themselves, but also through the stars, is the conflict between Hindu and Muslim Indians. And if you haven't done so yet, I really recommend that you watch that video I shared on Facebook, so that you have a greater understanding of what that conflict is. So there's been several films that have kind of represented both conflict between Hindu and Muslims, Indians, but also just general Islamic life, as well as some other religious lives as well, and kind of how they intersect. So questionings of religious identity, religious ideals, as well as religious conflict, and the kind of discussions around religiosity within India has increased significantly over the past few years as well. So a couple of films, or a couple of examples of films like this can be seen through Dev, which was a 2004 film which focused on the Hindu Muslim 2002 riots or conflict. It was a big conflict between the two groups. Another example is Dozak in 2015, which focuses on an Islamic imam and his son kind of befriends a Hindu community and Hindu family, and then the father kind of rejects him for doing that, and then eventually kind of they reconnect again. So really looking at like religious values as well as religious identity. And then on top of that, Shah Rukh Khan and Saif Ali Khan, which, as we know, Shah Rukh Khan is a massive star within Bollywood, but then Saif Ali Khan, we might remember him from like La Baj Kal, are massive actors within Bollywood and are also Muslim, and they're quite big in Bollywood, and so Bollywood kind of tends to do that a lot. They take on board many different actors from various religious backgrounds, Muslim being a large kind of group within Bollywood, especially because of the Khan family. But then also they tend to have other religious groups like Sikhs, Hindus, and even agnostic or atheists. And so because of that, Bollywood is also kind of projected as being one of the least religiously segregated places within India. And then, however, Bollywood is reluctant to discuss these religious issues due to fear of censorship, especially because these conflicts are still ongoing. That there's still a lot of tension between Muslims and Hindus, especially, and so a lot of producers kind of are reluctant to discuss that, although it is increasing. And through that increasing discussion, that's kind of influencing Indian society to increase its acceptance and tolerance of various religious groups. Another positive impact Bollywood has had on Indian society and just general society overall is through its continuation of romance as an internal mythology, which it seems to reject, even though it displays it, illicit romantic relationships. So Love Ajkal is a perfect example of this. So whilst it demonstrates, live-in relationships, sex, premarital sex, and just general promiscuity between both men and women characters, it's projected as being not the desirable relationship, not the desirable way to have a relationship. And this is definitely demonstrated through the end of the film, in which the main characters follow the more traditional Indian path of settling down and forming a relationship through marriage. Also, a common story within Bollywood is a couple in love separated due to family desires or rivalries, sometimes based upon religion, class, caste, race, or wealth. Clear examples of that is Humpty, as well as, to some extent, Student of the Year, through the kind of the rejection of the relationship through a class base, both in which have been class-based. And then on top of that, the physical displays of affection, kissing, which was banned in Bollywood up until the 1980s, and Bollywood has kind of maintained that self-imposed ban, bar a few exceptions, as we generally don't see much kissing within the films, and if we do see a bit of kissing, it kind of stops there. Kind of sexual relationships aren't necessarily represented within the films. Instead, it's kind of shown through the songs and dance. So erotic aspects of love are suggested through the songs and the dance, especially because they only occur in a fantasy world. They don't occur in the reality of the story. And by doing this, it's kind of celebrating those family values by rejecting showing more physical connections of relationships, by maintaining the importance and significance of traditional relationships and romances, and maintaining family values. Yeah, it's really a celebration of those family values, whilst also an affirmation of Indian tradition. So it's kind of perpetuating those traditional Indian values and culture to wider audiences, as well as diasporic audiences, as well as maintaining and socializing that for Indian audiences within India. And then lastly, another positive impact is the growing focus on the diaspora is also leading to a globalized cultural community. This is especially positive for persons of Indian origin, as they're able to share in the similarity of experience when consuming Bollywood. And for a part of the diaspora, this is really positive for them, because Bollywood is kind of the only means in which they can connect to their Indian culture. And so it's really positive for them to try to understand their Indian heritage and their Indian culture, and kind of through that dissemination process of the distribution of the films, as well as the associated paraphernalia like the music, like the clothing, even like the magazines, that whilst they're representing more contemporary social values, they're still maintaining traditional cultural values as well. It's kind of projecting India, its people and its culture as an export to the rest of the world, which means that it's providing Indians, especially PIOs and NRIs, to perpetuate and connect with their heritage and culture globally. So again, this can be arguably seen as a positive impact for the diaspora, as it's a means to reconnect with their culture and to maintain maintain and perpetuate their cultural identity, but also can arguably seen as a negative, which is something we'll discuss in more detail, because it's kind of hybridizing Indian culture, which can have negative implications for Indians within India, as well as kind of just a general understanding of traditional Indian culture. So some of the negative impacts, which we should be kind of, some we should be aware of already, but we'll still go through them in some detail. Bollywood has kind of from the 1960s continued to focus on youth in India, as well as youth that are a part of the diaspora. Especially more recently, we're seeing that even more so with the removal of the family as much within India. So we're seeing less of the family desires and more of youth desires. So this began in the 1960s with a greater focus on youth culture through the films. So examples of this are like Bobby in 1973 and Love Story in 1981, which were both centered around teenage romance. Youth culture is generally represented through fashion, so we can see this through their clothing, their hairstyles and their makeup, as well as kind of the lifestyles that they live. And through this kind of projection of fashion, especially for the youth, it's seen as kind of a means in which it's kind of influencing how Indians should dress. This is especially the case because fashion designers are integrated with the film. And so because they're integrated within the film industry, their clothing items are regularly remade and distributed. And again, not only what is projected in the films, but the fact that they're being remade and distributed means that it's definitely influencing the way Indians are dressing and behave, kind of the way they're behaving in Indian society as well. And then kind of the current movement to represent more Western style fashion and youth lifestyle is influencing Indians abroad as well as at home. We can see this as already discussed through the emphasizing on more modern and Western lifestyles, like through those live-in relationships, premarital sex, those kinds of things. This can lead to kind of a potential negative loss of culture, and especially for conservative groups, because they're seeing that kind of diluting of their Indian cultural values, traditional cultural values, and traditional Indian lifestyles as well, because within a lot of the films we're seeing a movement away from arranged marriages and movement towards individuals choosing their own love relationships. So definitely a diluting of that traditional practice within India. But however, this can be seen as a positive for youth and middle class, as they're wanting their lifestyle, affluent lifestyle and youth culture to be represented within the films. So can be seen as a bit of a positive and negative for different groups. And then lastly, another negative impact can be seen through the increasing corporatized power of Bollywood within stars, directors and producers. Through this increasing corporatized power and their growing focus on, gaining wealth and revenue and profits, this is kind of increasing that interest to cater to wide audiences, which therefore means Bollywood is kind of now, as we've seen, is caught between the need to modernize whilst also maintaining those traditional moral values and culture, so as to not lose any interested markets or audiences. And because of this kind of growing production and revenue within Bollywood, we're seeing that increase in production value, which therefore means again that Bollywood is focusing more on depicting modern, affluent, consumerist lifestyles rather than, say, valorizing the poor. So, and again, as we know, India for the most part has a majority, whilst it has an increasing middle class, it still is largely made up of a poorer group of people. And so increasingly Bollywood is not really reflecting their lifestyles, which is having a massive impact on how much the poor can actually connect with and associate with the popular culture, which is problematic because, again, as we know, Bollywood is seen as that representation of Indian lifestyle and Indian culture and Indian values. And so this constant representation of the wealth is to an extent alienating and disassociating poor Indians, not only from the popular culture, but just from their general society as well, as they feel like a disconnect from what the national identity is and kind of their lifestyles as well. However, whilst it could be argued as a positive that Bollywood has maintained and continued family-oriented mythologies and use of music, the increase in diasporic and Western audiences has seen a westernising of these certain aspects. So again, whilst Bollywood maintains that family-oriented mythologies, we're still seeing a westernised influence in that, in terms of the live-in relationships and sex before marriage, as well as in music. We're seeing an increase in westernisation in terms of that music through the increasing of rapping, reggae remixes, as well as dance routines, which are increasingly over-sexualized through their movements like hip thrusting. And again, something that we've discussed is the increasing use of dialogue of Hinglish, so a combination of Hindustani and English, which is being argued by conservative groups and political groups as being a bastardization of the classical art, and kind of again diluting traditional cultural practices and values. All of this is kind of leading to that questioning over, national identity and what it means to be Indian, because they're kind of, again, diluting Indian culture and Indian cultural values by their desire to try to reach and expand their audiences globally. And through, again, as I've previously discussed, Bollywood is kind of being seen as neglecting domestic Indian audiences, especially the majority poor audiences within India.